Devontae Adams, Michael Pittman, and Nico Collins are all wide receivers that are locked into the top 20 picks this year. But it wasn't always that way. They all finished outside the top 70 in their rookie seasons. Today, we're going on a search for second and third year wide receivers who are primed to break out and ready to win you your league on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. I've got good news and bad news for you today. The good news, my new microphone's arrived, so you should hopefully be able to hear me a little bit more clearly, at least as I try to get the settings sorted out. Bad news is my voice is a little bit cooked at the moment, so we're going to keep this video short. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube and check out all the other content we've got going on. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com, where you can find all of my rankings. You can also find my articles at football.rasball.com. Today, we're talking about wide receivers, and we're looking for guys that are primed to break out. We're looking at that second and third year guys who are ready to take that next big step up. This used to be a big thing we talked about in the past. We used to always expect that wide receivers would struggle in their rookie season, and then they'd slowly develop into good, solid starters. That's always the way it used to happen. But these days, we're kind of accustomed to the rookies breaking out immediately. That's not always the case. We've seen some familiar names manage to do it later on in recent years. And I'm expecting a couple of guys who've been disappointing up to this point in their careers could be ready to turn into those fantasy league winners. So let's get into it. Firstly, let's have a look at what we're actually looking for in a breakout wide receiver. Firstly, obviously, we want someone who we're expecting to have an every down starting role. Really hard to break out if you're not on the field for the vast majority of snaps. You also want an improved offense, either because you're moving to a different team or because you've got new coaching staff or a new quarterback. That means something's likely to change. It could also potentially mean that someone else has left and there's an opportunity open. The third thing that I really like is someone who was trending in that direction towards the end of last year, someone who had a really strong finish to 2023 and is ready to take that momentum into this season. Ideally, someone also that's recovered from injury, so potentially injuries might have affected them previously and now they're healthy. That's also a really good sign that someone could potentially break out. And also we look at a little bit of preseason buzz, although I got to be honest, that is by far the fifth and last thing on this list. So let's go through my list, starting at number 5. And number 5, I got to be honest, guy I'm not massively enthused about, but I still do think that he has a chance to break out despite the fact his team's going to be pretty rubbish this year. I'm talking Marvin Mims. I know a lot of people have been talking about Troy Franklin coming in, but I think Mims is actually the main guy who's going to take over eventually that number 2 role. I do think there's the upside there that he could be the guy that plays primarily opposite Courtland Sutton, and that could be a very valuable role. I think early on in the year, we could see quite a lot of Josh Reynolds, but I'm hoping Mims will at least be involved. And I'm hoping as the year goes on, Mims turns into that true number 2. I wouldn't say I feel particularly confident about this, but you're getting him literally last round in your drafts. So he's someone you can stash on your bench and just see what happens. There has been some positive buzz coming out of Denver camp around him. His snaps did rise over the course of last year, though he was still stuck behind little Jordan Humphrey, which is rarely a good sign because he's not exactly a high quality player. They brought in some better competition this year, but I do think that they're still expecting for Mims to take that step forward. It's the same coaching staff, but it is a new QB. I'm not sure it's actually a quarterback upgrade. Russell Wilson was actually kind of solid last year, but we know Bo Nix can at least run a functional offense. I'm not really convinced that they're going to be able to get the run game truly going this year. That whole side of things looks like it's going to be a bit of a mess. They're probably going to be chasing quite a few games, so it is possible that you get some big plays out of Mims. My favorite situation to draft Mims is in best ball because he is known for making some really big plays. So in those situations, I'll draft him in the very last round I can and just see what happens over the first few weeks. A guy in a pretty similar situation in that he's a similar style of player who's kind of been stuck behind a little bit is Jamon Williams. But we know he actually comes with a whole lot more quality. We saw it when he was in college. We know he's a very good player. He's suffered from injuries a whole lot. He had ACL tear in his final year of college. He then had a hamstring strain last season as well. So realistically, he hasn't actually gone into a season healthy, or at least stayed healthy for much of a season. Towards the end of last year, he was a little bit healthier and his snaps rose as the year went on. And I do think that with Josh Reynolds out the door and going to Denver, as we talked about, Jamison Williams could be the guy who turns into a breakout with the Lions. The problem with the Lions is that they're not particularly pass heavy. There haven't really been that many changes to the offense, and I'd expect that we still see a whole lot of the running backs. You still got Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta in front of him, so there is a limitation there, but I certainly think that there's the possibility he could jump into being a top 30 player possibly as one of those wide receiver twos who ends up with a solid role. The real upside is the possibility that Amon-Ra St. Brown might get injured. And if that happens, I do think Jamison Williams could take over and could be a guy who can be very valuable for you. So I don't really know when you'd want to be drafting him. It's probably around the time when you've drafted your whole starting lineup. So ideally, you want everyone in your starting lineup set, maybe not your quarterback, but everyone else. And then when you're starting to get bench wide receivers, you're looking for that upside. That's probably when I'm taking Williams. I think his ADP is probably about fair, though. So I don't think you're getting a bargain here. But I do think if you're going for upside, he's a guy that you can certainly go for here. Number 3 is Jaden Reed, and I know a lot of people would argue that he broke out last year, but there's still a lot of space for him to get better. Did you know he only played between 40 and 70% snaps in the vast majority of games last season? If they just get him out there as an every down player, all of a sudden you've got a real league winner on your hands. Now, I don't know that they're necessarily going to do that. They haven't changed anything about the offense. It's the same coaching staff. It's the same quarterbacks. All the same wide receivers are there. And Christian Watson's going to be healthier. So I do think it's possible that nothing changes and you just get the same old Reed. But Reed was still pretty solid last year. He was bordering on a top 24 player. So I think the upside's there. And there's also a pretty safe floor. And you can get him 5th, 6th round, which is pretty good value for me, especially in a PPR league. Now, for me, George Pickens was a guy that I thought was going to be a massive fantasy football star when he came into the NFL, and then he tore his ACL in college. And that really hurt him in his first year. He didn't look as explosive and he didn't look like the same player, but he has slowly recovered and he looked really solid last year. Now, Deontay Johnson, who's a bit of a target hog, is out. Plus, you've got a guy who's now going to be playing a high percentage of snaps. He was really only playing about 80% of snaps last season. So I do think that he's going to be able to step up with no Johnson. There's not really a lot of target competition here. I know there's been some buzz around Pat Freiermuth. You know the running backs are going to get some check downs. Plus, I do think they get Roman Wilson and perhaps Calvin Austin involved. But George Pickens is the clear number 1. We're talking about a guy who could truly break out into doing something that we saw Michael Pittman do last year, being on a pretty run-heavy offense, but being the sole true pass-catching option and therefore having a whole heap of upside. We know he's capable of making big plays. I do think with a better quarterback, now that we've actually brought in Russell Wilson, who can throw the ball better than, well, all of the Steelers quarterbacks from last season, I do think that's going to be a big positive for him. Arthur Smith's a little bit scary as the new OC, but I'm hoping that Tomlin's at least going to keep things under control and make sure that they pass the ball enough. You can get him around the 4th round, and that seems about right to me. I do prefer him in half PPR, and I'd more happily take him there. The problem is you're not really, again, getting a bargain in this situation. It's kind of banked into his value, but I certainly think there's more upside here with Pickens than with most of the other guys into this range, where you're paying for a guy who's probably the second best in your team. I'm talking T. Higgins, I'm talking Devonta Smith. These are all guys you're taking ahead of Pickens. With Pickens, at least you know that potentially you're getting a number 1 weapon in the offense and that they might pass the ball a little bit more this year. Now, number 1 should surprise absolutely nobody. I'm sure he's on your list too. It's Drake London. I've been high on Drake London the whole offseason, and certainly his ADP is reflecting that. His ADP is insanely high on Fantasy Pros. It's not the same as that on a lot of sites. I would not take him anywhere near that high. I do think he's the number 1 player who's primed for a breakout. I think this is going to be a high-powered offense. I think you're going to see a lot of London, Pitts, and Bijan, and they're going to be the 3 weapons that really runs this offense through them. I do think that Kirk Cousins is capable of running a really high-scoring offense, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens here. London's been disappointing the last couple of years, but the quarterback play has been atrocious. The play calling's been atrocious, so I don't really know that you can blame that on him. He's someone that I like the idea of getting, but gosh, if I had to take him in the early second round, there's no way I'm even considering that. For me, he's someone who should be going a little bit later. I'm thinking like third round region. I think that's more reasonable for London, depending on your league setup and what you're kind of looking for in your league. I will talk a little bit more later on about league setup and how I can help you out with that sort of stuff as well. So London's my number one option, but he is a little bit expensive. Potentially you're in a deep league and you're looking for guys who might break out, but you want to get them really cheap. Let's look at a couple of those guys as well. So the number one is Khalil Shakir, and I don't really love his odds of breaking out, but you can get him really cheap. With Keon Coleman coming in, with this offense expected to go a lot more through the run game and Dalton Kincaid, people are forgetting that Shakir was actually pretty valuable last season. I know that Curtis Samuel is also going to have a role, but Shakir will be involved. He's more of a best ball guy for me. I do think there's best ball upside there, and certainly I wouldn't want him in PPR, but I do think that this is a guy who could potentially be a weapon, especially if there's an injury ahead of him. Because we saw last year when there were injuries, he was able to step into a slightly more high volume role. So I think there's upside here and you can get him very late. Jalen Tolbert has a lot less upside, but you can get him pretty much free, even in dynasty leagues. We're talking about a guy who's near certainly going to be the number 3 wide receiver behind CeeDee Lamb and also Brandon Cooks. And Cooks is aging. So there's no reason to think that Tolbert can't eventually step into that number 2 role. And we've seen him be pretty solid. We're talking about a guy who was a day 2 pick a couple of years ago and had disappointed, but is slowly starting to turn into the guy that they expected him to be. There has been a little bit of positive buzz about him out of Cowboys camp as well. So I do like his upside, and I like the idea of stashing him on my bench in a very deep league. Trey Tucker is another one that I'd only be interested in a deep league. The biggest issue I have here is not that whether he's going to be a starter, because he will. He's going to be the starting slot guy ahead of Michael Gallup. They basically said that. But I'm very concerned about whether that's going to be an every down role. I do think with Brock Bowers turning up and with Michael Mayer still being there, that we probably see a lot of 12 personnel, and that means that Tucker gets less of a role. He's probably off the field in those situations. Potentially, he can slowly take over from Devontae Adams or alternatively from Jakobi Meyers and turn into at least a number 2 option for them and at least be out there every down. We know that Hunter Renfrow turned in a wide receiver 13 season with the Raiders. This isn't the same Raiders though. So I don't think that upside is quite there, but I do think he's kind of a safe guy who could break out relative to what he's done previously and put in at least a top 50 or top 60 season. Jalen Hyatt's another guy that I'd really like to see a little bit more from, but I do think he might be stuck behind Darius Slayton. But you're kind of paying for that. That's kind of banked into his value. We do know Malik Neighbors is going to be the number 1 guy. Wan'Dale Robinson's probably going to be the slot guy primarily. It's going to be a case of Hyatt versus Slayton. I'm not convinced they're really committed to Slayton. He seems to want a massive contract. They don't seem to want to give him much at all. It wouldn't surprise me if Hyatt, being a day 2 guy, could eventually break out. I think there's some upside here. But again, there's such a high downside, the possibility they might not even start, that you're only taking him in very deep leagues in the very last rounds. Cedric Tillman's the last one, and there has been buzz out of Brown's camp that he's going to be the starting outside receiver ahead of Elijah Moore. I don't know how much I exactly trust that. It wouldn't surprise me if starting outside receiver means a guy who's getting 60% snaps. He's clearly behind Amari Cooper. He's clearly behind Jerry Jeudy. He's going to be behind David Njoku. The run game's going to be valuable, and he's not even clearly the number 3 guy. But we're talking about a guy who does have some draft pedigree. He is a guy who was solid coming into the league, and we expected a bit more out of him. So it's not impossible that he'll build into something later on in his career. So he's someone that I'm kind of interested in getting in a deep dynasty league where you can stash him knowing that he could turn out to be a starter. I'm talking, 16, 20 team leagues where you've got solid bench space. He's the kind of guy I'd be interested in there. Now, let's talk about some guys that I don't think are going to break out. These are second and third year guys that I'm not particularly interested in. I think you're either going to have to pay too much or alternatively, you've kind of seen what you're going to get out of them. They're either going to take a step back or at least be a little bit average this season. The first is Jackson Smith-Njigba. I know a lot of people are pretty excited, but everything I've heard about this offense is probably going to run through DK Metcalf, and JSN and Tyler Lockett are kind of going to be relative afterthoughts. I still think Lockett's the clear number 2 guy. JSN's going to turn into that number 2 guy eventually, but gosh, I don't expect him to break out this year. I think he needs an injury in front of him for that to happen, and even so, I don't think that's necessarily locked in. So while an injury is always possible, you're not really drafting him in the right range to be expecting an injury and then getting the output that you would need from that injury. The chance of the injury is low, and the output you're getting if an injury happens, not particularly high. Zay Flowers was solid last year, but there's no reason for me to believe that he's going to take a step forward. Lamar Jackson has kind of shown that he's not the greatest passing quarterback. He's a better running quarterback. I do think that they're going to want the run game still humming. They've got Derrick Henry in there now, which is going to be better than Gus Edwards. They've also got plenty of other options there as well. Mark Andrews is back and healthy. I don't think we're going to expect anything more out of Zay Flowers. I think we're still expecting a guy to finish in that 20 to 25 range, and that's kind of where you're drafting him. That's not a breakout. That's just exactly what he was doing last season. So I'm not expecting more of Zay Flowers. I think if you draft him, you're basically getting a guy you're paying for. You don't win your league without getting any value. You kind of need a little bit more upside there, and that's why I'm kind of staying away from Flowers. Romeo Dobbs is in that really messy situation with Dontavian Wicks, who I've both included here. Dobbs is technically an every down player, but he's not getting the opportunities because Reed's sucking in so many targets. Christian Watson's now healthy. They're using the tight ends. They want to run the ball a lot. I just don't understand how Dobbs can possibly give you fantasy value without at least one or two injuries ahead of him. Wicks is the same situation. I've seen a lot of people take him late in draft, and I'm not really sure what they're hoping for. You would need an injury for him to actually get an every down role. And even for him to get as much value as he had last season, you're either going to need him to start taking over from Dobbs, which I don't think many people are expecting, or you'd need Jaden Reed to keep playing only 40 to 70% snaps. And I don't think that really makes sense. So I'm not interested in either of those Green Bay guys. I'm interested in Reed because I think the Breakout at least has a path where he can get more snaps. I don't really see it with those other two guys. Jordan Addison's the last one there. I know we've heard positive reports about him bulking up and getting faster and things like that, but I mean, there's no Kirk Cousins. Everyone else is going to be a step down. Sam Darnold's a step down. JJ McCarthy's a step down. It's not that Kirk Cousins is amazing. He's just aggressive and he keeps the offense rolling. He's willing to put balls into tight windows. He scores a lot of points. It creates a high-scoring offense. I don't think the same thing's going to happen this year. I think they're going to be a lot more passive, a lot more run-heavy, certainly a lot less willing to take chances because their defense isn't something they can rely on. So for that reason, I think that Addison's going to take a big step back, especially once TJ Hawkinson comes back halfway through the season. Last thing I want to talk about is your leagues. Now, if you're drafting in your league soon, or even if you're not drafting soon, you're just thinking about your drafts, I want to help you out. The reality is that most of the rankings online aren't based on your league. They're based on random league settings, and the positional value between those players isn't very high. I do rankings through Fantasy Pros, for example. I know that we never rank players between positions. We don't even think about it. We don't put it in there. And so any positional rankings compared in Fantasy Pros is going to be pretty random. It's going to be very good for helping you to predict which wide receiver you should take ahead of another, but it's not very good at telling you when you should take a running back, when you should take a wide receiver, when you should take a tight end. So I want to help you out with that. Very simply, you send me your league settings. I send you rankings perfectly suited to your league settings that can help you draft properly for a very small fee. Make sure you email me at benwasley23@gmail.com, and I'm happy to help you out. If you haven't already, of course, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. Gosh, it's getting dark in here now. Must be nearly evening for me. Hit us up on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can also check out all my articles at football.rasball.com. They also have a heap of tools that can help you in season and in the preseason as well. And finally, my rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I look forward to catching up with you next time on The Fantasy First Down.